Warning, this video contains spoilers for Danganronpa 1 and 2. Also, there will be mention of adult themes such as abuse and medical malpractice, so if you're a child, you should really not be watching this video. With that, enjoy the show.
Danganronpa. So I recently got around to finishing Danganronpa 2, Goodbye Despair, and what can I say? I loved it.
I've never played through a visual novel before, much less a murder mystery one, but I quickly found myself falling in love with the quirky characters, the humor, the gameplay, the art style, and especially the music. While I was working on this video, I just kept having the soundtrack playing over and over again on Spotify.
But as much as I've grown to love this game and kind of obsess over it, there's still one part that I really don't like, and that would be Chapter 3, Trapped by the Ocean Scent.
And I'm not alone in this. The third chapter has gained enough notoriety in the fanbase that even players on their first playthrough, much like me, know that most people don't like it. Oh boy, they weren't kidding about this one. The general consensus among fans is that the climactic third trial is not only the worst one in the game, but also one of the worst ones in the entire trilogy.
But I still don't think it's fair for me to sit here complaining about one bad chapter of an otherwise very good video game without at least taking my own shot at fixing it. And that's exactly what I plan to do. So join me as I comb through this entire fever dream of a murder, and let's rewrite Danganronpa 2, Chapter 3. If you're unfamiliar with the game, first of all, why are you watching this video? But in all seriousness, if you haven't played the game yet and you're just starting to get interested in it, or it's been a while since you've played it for the first time, here's a quick recap of everything that's happened up until Chapter 3.
You play as Hajime Hinata, one of 16 Ultimate students from Hope's Peak Academy. An Ultimate student is a high schooler who possesses an extraordinary skill unlike any other person alive. Ultimate photographer, ultimate mechanic, ultimate rich kid, you get the idea. All 16 students are sent to the abandoned Jabberwock Island for a quote-unquote school trip. There they meet the game's main villain, a sadistic teddy bear by the name of Monokuma. After he declares himself the teacher of the school trip, Monokuma tells the students 3 important things. Number 1, all of them have had their memories wiped of the last few years, including their time at Hope's Peak Academy. Number 2, everybody is now a prisoner on this island, and the only way to leave is to murder one of their classmates and to get away with it. Number 3, when a body is discovered, every survivor has to investigate and participate in a class trial where they try to solve the murder case. Monokuma will already know who's responsible, thanks to the island security cameras, but he will still make everybody vote on who they believe the murderer is. If they're right, Monokuma will execute the murderer, but if they aren't, the killer is allowed to leave the island while everybody else is executed in their place. By the start of Chapter 3, 4 deaths have already occurred on the island: Byakuya, Teruteru, Mahiru, and Peko. Another student, Nekomaru, is out of commission because of a near-death experience, which leaves the class at only 11 active students. So needless to say, everybody's feeling pretty bummed out right about now, so they all promise that nobody else will get murdered and that they'll stick together to find another way off the island.
Everybody got that? Good. Let's hop right into it.
After listening to other fans voice their own opinions, I've discovered 5 common complaints about Chapter 3. The motive, the victims, the killer's plan, the reveal, and the execution.
So looking through this list, it kind of seems like everything is wrong with this chapter, but that's not really fair. There are some parts that are worth preserving about this trial. So as I work through this list, I'm going to be sticking to the original plot as much as I can, and only make any drastic changes if I can justify my reasoning. And what better point to start off than... So nobody starts off a chapter really having the intent to kill, especially since either it means they're going to die or everybody else is going to. So at the start of every chapter, what Monokuma does is that he introduces a new motive to kickstart the killing.
In Danganronpa 2, the first motive is Monokuma promising to, eventually, return their school memories. The second motive is a creepy arcade game that implies one of them is responsible for the death of a student's little sister.
The third chapter is something called despair disease, which is a contagious illness that has feverish symptoms but also causes behavioral changes. It's introduced by 3 students immediately becoming infected. One can't stop crying, another believes everything she's told, and the other one just can't stop lying.
Immediately after, Monokuma explains the despair disease is meant to spread madness once it infects all the students, thus creating a fun scenario where nobody has their true personality when they kill. And it's implied that Monokuma has no intent of curing this disease because it's just meant to kickstart the killing.
Hey Monokuma, how is that a good motive? The best murder motives always promise a reward that outweighs the risk of death. It's like vital information or even revenge. I mean, I know if somebody tried to kill my little sister, I would certainly kill them. So if a player believes that a motive doesn't provide a good enough reason for another student to commit murder, that's where it falls short.
With the despair disease, it only motivates the students to quarantine the sick and try to wait it out. There's no patient zero who could be killed to prevent further spread of the disease, and even if somebody did want to murder all 3 patients, one of the killing game's explicit rules is that you can only kill up to 2 people. So, as an audience member, I don't buy this.
But what if Monokuma decided to promise everybody that the disease would be cured if another murder got committed? Because that could work. The original story has Monokuma cure everybody once a body is discovered anyways. If a murder meant protecting the healthy and potentially saving the sick, then I believe that would convince somebody to take the plunge and kill someone.
This sorry sack is pretty much on life support within a day, so the students do have proof that this disease is dangerous. All the more reason not to risk infection.
I know that some people who are fans of the series might say that this is a little bit too similar to the motive of Chapter 4, and to that I say, you're right. But at least people liked Chapter 4. But there's still a way to make this motive seem different enough from the 4th that it doesn't feel derivative. So that's going to be my first fix. Change the way that despair disease is used as a motive. But where there's murder, we can't forget about... One of the unspoken rules about the Danganronpa games is that the 3rd chapter is always going to involve 2 different bodies. So let's meet our lovely victims.
First is Ibuki Miyoda. As much as I like her, I can't really say I have a problem with her dying. Danganronpa games tend to get darker around Chapter 3, so wacky comic relief characters, like Ibuki, are usually already dead or on death's doorstep by this point of the story. So of course she had to bite it. We can't have too much sunshine in our island adventure murder game. But the second victim, Hyoko Saionji, is where people get angry.
Now, Hyoko is one of the most disliked characters in the entire franchise. Up until her death, she's an abrasive bully to just about everybody on the island except for one other person, and the second that somebody tries to give her her own taste of medicine, she cries.
But even though I was eagerly anticipating her death, Hyoko had a lot of potential as a survivor. If you can withstand her insults long enough to hang out with her, you learn that she came from an abusive family and developed her harsh nature as a form of self-defense from jealous competitors. And when she finally befriends Mahiro in Chapter 2, she ends up being framed as her own friend's killer. By the start of the 3rd chapter, there's evidence that Hyoko is trying to be a nicer person and come to terms with her grief. She even attempts to build a shrine to make sure Mahiro isn't forgotten or lonely in death. Aw, Hyoko. And then she's killed 5 seconds later, and nobody even bothers to figure out her murder weapon!
Because this game is so character-driven, it makes it stand out even more that Hyoko's arc seems completely unfinished. Seeing an abrasive girl try to open up to others after the death of her only friend could have been very interesting. And even then, it doesn't mean that Hyoko has to be nice. In fact, I would say some of her insults would be very funny going further into the game.
You nasty pig barf!
So let's leave Ibuki alone and let's focus on Hyoko instead. If we decide to spare her, who should end up taking her place?
Obviously, Hajime is off the table, as well as the future murderers and their victims. So that leaves us with 4 potential candidates. And of these 4, I think the best option is Sonia Nevermind, the ultimate princess.
Now, I like Sonia. She's positive, she's strong-willed, she's kind-hearted, and she has some of the best lines in the entire game.
Imbecile! I am not some woman with flexible legs!
But she's also the most expendable out of them all.
Kazuichi's talent as the ultimate mechanic, and being my favorite boy, makes him irreplaceable for future trials. Akane still has her own character arc to fulfill, so she's no good. And Fuyuhiko nearly died in Chapter 2, so it would be weird if he was killed off immediately in the next chapter. I mean, they do that anyways in Chapter 4 with somebody else, but that's besides the point. I'm only rewriting this chapter. But Sonia's main contribution to the story is in Chapter 2, and most of her roles later on could be fulfilled by other characters. And besides that, she doesn't really have a character arc to speak of.
So Sonia stands out because her character arc isn't going to be diminished if she dies earlier, and even if she does die, there's not going to be a whole lot lost. But there's even another additional bonus point for this. There's actually a very plausible reason for how Sonia could have ended up the murder victim instead of Hyoko.
Sonia tells us that she saw Hyoko earlier and that she was struggling to finish tying up her kimono. Sonia informed her that the music venue had a full-body mirror that she could use, but Hyoko just wanted to be left alone. In the original story, Hyoko sneaks out at night to use it, stumbles across the murder scene, and gets killed for her troubles. If we wanted to swap out Sonia for Hyoko, then all we would have to change is Sonia being the one to get the mirror, and boom! Good night, sweet princess. Then not only would Hyoko have to deal with Mahiru's death, she would also have to live with the knowledge that Sonia got killed while trying to help her. And I think that sets up an even richer journey for her to go on in later chapters.
But how do they end up dead in the first place? To fully understand the problem with this next section here, we're going to have to understand how everything exactly played out. So come with me.
So here we have a map of the whole third island, which is where the murder case takes place. And here are the 3 buildings that are relevant to this murder case. First we have the hospital, the music venue, and then the motel up here. And according to Hajime's own testimony, it's estimated that the distance from here to here and from here to here, they're all about 3 to 5 minutes in distance if everybody is running. And speaking of which, here's how everybody is split up before all of the bodies are discovered. Over in the hospital, we have Hajime, and therefore you, the 2 sick patients, and then the ultimate nurse, Mikan. A 5th student, Fuyuhiko, is walking towards the hospital from another part of the island. The remaining 4 healthy students are at the motel, and that leaves Ibuki and Hyoko lying dead in the music venue because the murders were carried out at night. What's important to remember going forward is that there is 2 surveillance cameras set up on the island for the students to stay in contact with one another. The first one is over here at the hospital so that everybody who's sick can still stay in contact with the healthy patients. And then over here, the second one is at the music venue. Now you might be wondering why the second one is at the music venue and not at the motel where everybody else is staying. Well, that's because this good lad up here, Kazuichi, explains that if it were still kept at the motel, it'd be too far out of range for the 2 sides to keep in contact with one another. So therefore, it has to stay right there. And with that, here is how all of the bodies are discovered. Hajime sees on the surveillance camera what looks like somebody hanging themselves over in the music venue playing out in real time. He immediately books it over there to stop it, only to find out that he's too late. Once he recovers from the shock, he runs to retrieve everybody still at the motel. After they meet up, they start heading back to the music venue where they find Fuyuhiko and Mikan, who are looking for Ibuki. The group then tries to open up the music venue door, find that it's jammed, and successfully try to break it down. But it's only then that they learn Hyoko's body has now joined the party. Now let's be generous here and say that even with everybody running at top speed, that this whole trip took about 10 minutes total. And during that time, here's everything that the killer had to accomplish. Stage a fake hanging scene in the hospital, including a ladder, a curtain, and costume. Destroy the camera they brought over from the music venue. Change clothes and clean up the fake hanging scene. Sprint over to music venue and sneak inside after Hajime left. Plant the remains of the destroyed camera. Tear down the wallpaper hiding Hyoko's body and stuff it inside the storage closet. Crank up the thermostat. Glue the doors shut to prevent people from breaking in too easily. Sneak back out and meet up with the other students. All without getting caught! And if that wasn't hard enough to believe, it becomes even more implausible when you realize who the murderer actually is. And that would be Mikan Sumiki, the ultimate nurse herself. One thing that you should know about Mikan is that she is notoriously clumsy. And the game makes sure that you know this because her clumsiness was an essential part in finding out who the murderer was in Trial 1. Not only that, Mikan is also infected with the despair disease, which has been proven to be a very debilitating disease. Reminder that this student is almost dead! So how can we make it so that Mikan stays as the murderer but is still able to accomplish all this? To do that, I have 3 small changes to suggest. First, establish how Mikan isn't as incapacitated by the despair disease as everybody else. I mean, she is the ultimate nurse after all. Who better to be resistant to it? Second, make it take longer for Hajime to collect all the other students so Mikan has more time to put everything into action. And third, make the stage hanging scene not playing out in real time, but a recording. In the original game, we learned from Kazuichi that the surveillance cameras can't broadcast pre-recorded footage. So, why not just change that? Is this a perfect crime? Hell no, I'm not a murder mystery novelist. And that is on purpose, because if it was a perfect crime, then there wouldn't be Let's talk about Mikan for a second. For the first 2 chapters of the game, to put it bluntly, Mikan is pathetic. She's constantly crying and feels like her existence is a burden to others. She keeps begging for forgiveness for even tiny little mistakes. And given that the game implies that she was an abuse victim, that's not really surprising. But her classmates, mostly, treat her with kindness and patience, even defending her when she's accused of being a murderer. But as I mentioned before, she was infected with the despair disease, presumably because she was helping out the sick patients. And like them, she got a very interesting symptom as a result, recalling her lost memories. And as it turns out, a Mikan with all of her memories is actually a pretty sick and twisted individual.
Huh? Is that all you can say? Ah, so in the end, you're all just a bunch of bullies, huh? I'm done with that! You hear me? I'm
minority here, but I actually really enjoyed this twist, probably more than some other people did. It hints that something more sinister is going on if Mikan's memories make her a completely different person.
This feeling, I know it well. Like the floor is collapsing, like the sky is falling down upon you. This feeling of despair!
I'm not gonna lie, I felt very betrayed by this reveal when it was playing out in the game. I mean, Mikan is one of my favorite characters. Part of the reason I decided to do this video in the first place is because I just love her that much. So to hear her talk about how foolish we were for trusting and befriending her own passive self, it kind of hurt. I really didn't want to believe that this was Mikan any more than anybody else did in that trial. But even then, I have to agree with the rest of the community about where this reveal falls short.
The first issue is motivation. Mikan kills the girls for the sake of causing despair in memory of her beloved, who is already dead and supposedly the only person who ever loved her. So yeah, she's a bit unhinged.
But players usually want a reason for why their favorite characters die. I mean, even Hyoko is somebody's favorite character. Ibuki did nothing wrong, so it's already disappointing that she got killed. But Hyoko, who was Mikan's primary tormentor, that wasn't even a factor in why she decided to kill her. I mean, it was literally right there. How could you be so blind to such a good opportunity? And remember how I said once the bodies were discovered, everybody had their despair disease cured? Well, with everybody else, that also meant that their symptoms got removed, but not Mikan's. So even as she goes into her execution, she's still recalling all of her old memories of her beloved, how much she craves despair, and is actually looking forward to her execution.
Creepy, yes, but executions are meant to bring the killer to their absolute lowest before finally finishing them off. It just makes it that much more unsatisfying to see Mikan die as somebody completely different and looking forward to her death. This isn't the character we grew to love, so why should I ultimately care about her?
Like I said before, I want to still give my respect to the original creators of the game and the story they wanted to tell. I'm only changing this slightly in order to make it feel a little bit more satisfying. Regarding the victims and why they were chosen, I think I've already touched on how that can be improved on. Ibuki is already super vulnerable, so it makes sense that Mikan would target her, knowing that she would be able to get away with anything. And regarding Sonia, because there isn't that background history of bullying, it's a lot more satisfying for me to believe that Mikan would choose to target Sonia just because she happened to be in the wrong place in the wrong time, and there isn't that underlying dissatisfaction for feeling like there was an unexplored arc, like there is with Hyoko. The change I'm gonna make involves how Mikan is revealed to have the despair disease. Don't cure Mikan when everybody else is cured. Instead, wait until after everybody votes in the class trial to finally cure her. And when I say cure, I mean cure. Take away her memories of her beloved, of her despair, everything that she remembered while she was sick. You'll see why. Because we're coming to the highlight of every single Danganronpa chapter.
If there's one thing that all Danganronpa fans can agree on, it's that the execution scenes are awesome! Because when the guilty party is sentenced to death, Monokuma pulls out all the stops and gives them the most miserable and most spectacular send-off possible.
If you want to know how much the fandom loves these scenes, you should know that it's very common for fans to make their own execution scenes for the students who never got one in the first place. We might be sadistic, and well.
Now, Mikan is the 9th execution in the series, and the 4th time a woman is center stage. 5th if you were an idiot and got the bad ending of Danganronpa 1. And I want to emphasize that for every execution thus far, there has never been a real difference between how the women die and how the men die.
A common trope in media, especially stuff that's geared towards a primarily male audience, there tends to be this habit of women being put into sexually suggestive positions against their will. This sometimes involves panty shots, wardrobe malfunctions, skimpy outfits. I mean, if you've seen a piece of media in the past, I don't know, since the beginning of time, you've probably seen an instance where a woman was put into a very compromising position and she was probably embarrassed by it. It's considered very degrading towards women because it kind of reduces us to a piece of meat for a man to ogle at. And trust me, Danganronpa is not immune to this. But something that I think is very important to stress is that this has never been an issue when it comes to student executions.
The burning of the Versailles Witch, after-school lesson, the ultimate punishment, one-woman army. Never once do they try to make you think that this high school girl is sexy and always tries to emphasize how terrifying this situation is. You could easily substitute a man for any one of these executions and it would still make sense. They even do that in the original.
In a game where no character is truly safe, it's often reassuring to know that in the end, it doesn't matter what gender you are, death does not discriminate, and your punishment is going to be awful. Anyways, Mikan's execution has her orgasming on top of an overgrown pulsating arm, and the audience gets a naked body shot and a panty shot before she's launched into outer space, never to be seen again. Thanks for that.
I could have probably written a whole essay about how overly sexualized Mikan is, especially considering she's a victim of abuse. But then I couldn't spend most of this essay cosplaying, and her execution does a pretty good job of summing up the worst of it.
But even if that didn't happen, this is still a pretty execution. Student executions are meant to be some of the most emotionally charged scenes of every Danganronpa chapter. I mean, for the love of God, a child is getting murdered.
A good execution can make you feel a little sympathetic for the victim, no matter what your opinion of them is. Like, seriously. Jesus!
Part of that is usually because we have some sort of emotional connection, whether it's because we genuinely like them or have just spent so much time with them. So to see them go off to their own death is kind of a chilling experience. But it's not just the emotional connection, it's also seeing how the person dies. But what about Mikan? What was going through her head at this moment?
Apparently she was excited to see her beloved again in death, but she looks pretty unemotional during all of this. Also, this is just sort of a lame way to kill the ultimate nurse. Most executions invoke some sort of imagery involving the person's ultimate talent. Taro was the ultimate cook, and he got deep fried in a volcano. Pekka was the ultimate swordswoman, and she died battling an army of samurai robots. How the hell did Mikan die? Did she asphyxiate in space? What's that got to do with being a nurse?
Some fans have theorized that this is meant to be an elaborate metaphor for how Mikan was being overdosed by medicine when she was dying. And that's actually a pretty interesting idea. And there's even some, justification to the whole orgasming thing, because apparently a near-death experience causes your body to release a huge bunch of... I'm not even gonna finish that, it's stupid. But still, just why this? What's the giant arm got to do with anything? Is it because you were injecting something into her arm? Is it because, I don't know, she's afraid of big things? I don't know, that's what her character bio says.
It's not like executions have to be super grounded in reality. Looking at you, Mondo Butter. But at least they still make some sort of logical sense for the person who's getting killed.
So what do I think would personally improve by Byaku's? Get rid of the fan service, first of all, let's just do that. But I really enjoy the interpretation of somebody being overdosed to death. That's something that really hasn't been done before in the series, and that just sounds chilling to me. After all, what's one way to make the pain go away? Give them a dose of something to calm them down, especially in the arm. So maybe there's something we can do with this. Alright, we've got our notes, we've got our game plan, and now it's time we give it everything we got. Let's rewind the tapes and try one more time and see how Chapter 3, Trapped by the Ocean Scent, could have gone.
Trapped by the Ocean Scent begins as it normally does and hits the same plot beats as before, up until the morning where Monokuma introduces the next motive. This time, when despair disease is introduced, it only infects one student. It doesn't really matter who, but let's say it's this guy, Nagito. When asked about what's going on, Monokuma explains that this is a new motive. Every day that goes by, more people are going to be infected by this disease until eventually it spreads to everyone in the entire class. Now, while they could show some initiative to try and find a cure on their own, that may take a long time. And who knows if by that point there will even be people healthy enough to work on it. So Monokuma offers out of the kindness of his heart to give them the cure when another murder is committed. Since by this point everybody's pretty sick and tired of all the death, the students decide to go search for the cure by themselves. Nagito is put in the hospital, Mikan acts as his nurse, and life goes on. Within the next day and a half, we get Akane, Ibuki, and secretly Mikan infected with the despair disease. Hajime and Fuyuhiko volunteer to stay at the hospital in case Mikan needs extra help, the rest of the class hides out in the motel, and they set up the surveillance monitors in the hospital and in the music venue. Only this time, Kazuichi mentions that there's an option to record and play back footage, so be sure to press the one that activates the live feed whenever they're supposed to chat. There's only a limited amount of tape in the cameras after all. But despite the fact that everybody's been trying to avoid the people staying at the hotel, people are still getting paranoid that the disease is going to spread no matter how careful they are. What's worse is that Nagito is progressively getting worse and is on the brink of death, and they're no closer to finding a cure than before. And that's when everything starts to go wrong. The night of the murder comes, and for the most part, everything plays out as normal. Driven mad by her regained memories, Mikan sets her plan into action. As the ultimate nurse, she's built up a natural resistance to some of the feverish symptoms and has maintained her strength and focus. Enough strength to kill Ibuki in cold blood after luring her to the music venue. But before she can finish the job, Sonia Nevermind wanders inside. Hours earlier, she had stumbled upon Hyoko struggling to tie up her kimono by herself, and when she offered help, she was quickly rebuffed. Hyoko said that she could do it by herself if only her mirror was larger, and originally Sonia thought nothing of it. But by that night, she happened to remember that there was a full-length mirror over in the music venue that Hyoko could use. All she would have to do was wheel it back to the motel. And because Sonia is generally less paranoid about another murder happening, she decides to take care of it right away and not bother disturbing anybody else while they're asleep. But that ends up being her fatal mistake. The morning comes. Because Mikan has already pre-recorded the hanging scene the night before with the hospital's camera, she can be there when Hajime arrives and shows him the footage herself, letting him believe that it's live and that it just started playing when she got to it. Together, they head to the music venue and see Ibuki's corpse. Because she's in too much of a state, Hajime tells Mikan to go wait for Fuyuhiko at the hospital while he gathers up the others. Once he's gone, Mikan doubles back to the music venue, reveals Sonia's corpse, hides the evidence, glues the door shut, and then goes to catch up to Fuyuhiko. Meanwhile, Hajime is at the motel trying to get everybody to come out. The problem is that Hyoko refuses to come out because she isn't dressed, and Sonia is suspiciously ignoring them. And because one of these boys is a massive simp for Sonia, he refuses to leave her behind until they eventually force open the door and find that the princess is missing. Fuyuhiko quickly returns with Mikan, who is still a mess, and they get to the music venue, break down the door, and see everything laid out in plain sight. It's investigation time! Little has to be changed about the investigation and the evidence, but in order to account for the change in the victims and the setup, here are a couple of things I think could be added as potential evidence. Sonia's bed is still unmade, suggesting that she snuck out at night and expected to come back. There's a little homemade gift tag in her room, addressed to Hyoko. Sonia has her throat sliced, similarly to how Hyoko's was in the original. But Fuyuhiko, the ultimate yakuza, aka the ultimate gangster, who has experience with murders, determines that the slice was from a very thin and very small blade. Not like a knife meant for killing, but definitely something sharp. When Hajime goes to the hospital, he sees Mikan messing with the surveillance monitor. She says that she was checking it for clues, and when Hajime investigates the camera for himself, he finds that the roll of tape is missing. After the investigation, the class goes to trial and people start presenting their evidence. This time, however, we get a little more closure to the case. Hyoko remembers mentioning to Sonia that she was looking for a large mirror, and that brings people's minds to the mirror that was in the music venue. It's suggested that Sonia had gone there with the intent of surprising Hyoko the next morning, hence the gift tag, and also keeping Hyoko from being seen outside without her kimono. When looking over Sonia's wound again, Fuyuhiko mentions how precise the cut was. The way that it was handled implies that whoever used it was familiar with this kind of tool and would know just how to cut it right to have it be lethal. After some discussion, somebody mentions it looks just like a scalpel. And who would not only have access to a scalpel, but have the knowledge of how to use it properly? A nurse, just like Mikan. People get angry when we accuse her, but Mikan flies off the handle and the trial proceeds with her as the primary suspect. In the original game, one of the clinches in the argument is that Mikan is aware of the angle the fake hanging scene was shot at, something that Hajime hadn't mentioned before, and it's a pretty shaky reason to be honest. But this time around, Mikan slips up by asking how she could have been able to stage a fake hanging scene when she was with Hajime the whole time and it was supposedly happening live. That leads to the proposition that it was actually a recording that Mikan had made ahead of time. After all, she was the one who stayed at the hospital all night and first showed Hajime the video saying that she had answered the call. And she was supposedly checking the camera for clues, when in reality, she could have been getting rid of the tape that contained the recording. The class votes once they realize that she's afflicted with despair disease. Mikan is correctly selected as the killer, and she goes on her whole spiel about her beloved and her loving despair, including that of her own impending death. Monokuma decides that's too boring for him, and not despairing enough for the students, so he promptly cures Mikan and effectively wipes her memories. She panics as she starts to lose her memories of her beloved, of her love for despair, of her excitement for being able to experience the despair-inducing execution. But it's too late. She's returned to the state she was prior to being infected. She remembers killing her classmates. She remembers how she did it. Yet she doesn't remember why or for who. She can only express guilt and terror, sobbing as she begs for her classmates to forgive her one last time. But before anybody can say anything, As the silence settles around us, we ask ourselves if we should feel guilty for sending Mikan to her death. Can we trust that everybody else isn't also just as twisted as she was with her own memories? Can we trust that we will want to know what we're like with ours? But before we can reflect on that too long, the chapter ends.
So, that's how I would rewrite Chapter 3. Is it a perfect ending? Oh god, no. If only I were that confident. There are still some issues that I didn't even address that people have with this chapter. For example, the fact that there are 2 victims to begin with, the fact that Nekomaru wasn't a part of the trial. Hell, there was even an entire copycat murder setup that I didn't even bother acknowledging. Because I forgot about it, it was that irrelevant. But like I said at the start, I love this game, and this chapter had a lot of great potential, even if it just had a flawed execution. I only rewrote this chapter because I love that game so much, and I'm very sad that there's one part I really don't enjoy. There's kind of this culture where you can't say anything negative about something. You have to either be praising the ever-loving hell out of it, or you gotta be saying it's the worst piece of that's ever existed. But that's not really healthy, and it's also very taxing. It's important to be critical of your favorite games and admit when some things aren't as good as the others, but that shouldn't stop you from enjoying the overall experience. It's important to appreciate the effort that went into making this game in the first place, because otherwise, I wouldn't have something to care about so much that I'd make a whole 30-minute video about it. So even if it didn't go exactly how I wanted to, I know I'm going to be playing Danganronpa 2 sometime again in the very near future. Because despite the low point of Chapter 3, I just love the game too much. The music too much, and most importantly, the characters too much.